Thank you all for coming. I can see we now have some regulars in the audience, that is, those who have come to all or some of the lectures before. So this is the third in a series of lectures which together make up what I've called a short course on the history of Armenians in the 20th century. The first lecture, as you might remember, was largely about the Russians, Armenians in Russia, the Tsarist Empire, the problem of three different images of Armenians, the clergy, the commercial, and the conspirators. The second was about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, which led us to discuss at some length the genocide of 1915. And today I'm going to talk about the post-genocide period and the formation of a new nation of Armenians in the Soviet Union. And I want to begin this story with my own tale, a kind of experience I had when 20 years ago I went to Armenia, and after an absence of about 7 years. I hadn't been in the newly independent Armenia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I came back, and there I met something that I didn't expect. I found a new sense of nation most dramatically. So I was entering a world that I thought I knew because I had been one of those few scholars, in fact, few diaspora Armenians, who had actually gone repeatedly to Yerevan and done research there. But now Armenia was different. It had, by 1997, gone through a decade of devastation, beginning with the struggle over Karabakh in February 1988, and then a devastating, destructive earthquake that killed about 25,000 people, and from which you could say the country almost never fully recovered. There was the war with Azerbaijan, with tens of thousands of young people and civilians killed. There was the economic blockade by Azerbaijan and the Republic of Turkey. The collapse of the old Soviet economy and the political order that went with it. And there was the creation of a new, ostensibly democratic political order, but one that was ridden with corruption, cronyism, and cynicism. Optimists at the time spoke of a transition to democracy, and they were happy about the end of state socialism and the creation of capitalism, a market economy. But ordinary Armenians for that decade, and when I got there in the late 1990s, had experienced and were still experiencing rapid impoverishment, radical social polarization, and very dismal prospects for the future. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians, maybe as many as 40% of the population, left the country. They voted with their feet and went to Europe, to Russia, and to Los Angeles, Glendale, Pasadena. In place of the tattered and discredited Soviet ideology. You like that one better? Yeah, it's on. Instead of the discredited Soviet ideology, many in the political and intellectual elite espoused a fervent and increasingly intolerant nationalism. So I'd been invited to come to Yerevan to speak at a conference about the prospects for regional integration in the South Caucasus, whether or not Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia could find some way to live together. Well, you might imagine, especially now, that this was a truly utopian topic at a moment of ethnic conflict among Armenians and Azerbaijanis, Georgians, Abkhazians, and Ossetians, and problems with Russia as well. So what I decided to do was talk about the long history of Armenia and the way in which Armenians, Georgians, Azerbaijanis, Persians, Turks, Russians, and others had managed during the long periods of empire to live together, never equally, never fully peacefully, but nevertheless they managed to coexist in a cosmopolitan imperial setting. But then, with the coming of modern nationalism, the Armenian state, first under the Soviets and later in independence, over time became more and more ethnically homogeneous. Now, Armenia was, by the way, the most homogeneous, the most single ethnicity state in the whole of the Soviet Union. Something like 90% of Soviet Armenia's population were Armenians, in fact. But now, each of these republics was becoming more and more homogeneous, more and more nationalist, and more antagonistic to the other republic, and war, in fact, was the answer. So where had this imperial multinationality or multinationalism gone? Why had this happened? And was it a good thing that it had happened? Those were the things that I began to discuss. Well, as I was talking about this, I didn't quite appreciate how hostile people in Yerevan had become to the idea of a more cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic setting. I mentioned, for instance, sometime in passing, that the city of Baku in the 19th century had been a multinational city in which Armenians, who made up a large part of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, had done quite well and had even played a significant role in the governance of the city. No problem there. And here's an example of this eclectic scene here of the way different peoples lived together in the 19th century Caucasus. These pictures are from Baku. But at one time I mentioned that Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, Tiflis, had an Armenian majority. But at the same time, the city of Yerevan, now the capital of Armenia, had, at the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, been primarily a Muslim town and had been Muslim at several points in its history. So the emphasis of the talk was to question and even criticize the usefulness of ethno-nationalism in the current state of affairs, and to propose what we call a constructivist understanding of nationness in place of the usual primordialist convictions of the nationalists. I'll explain that in a while. Here's what I said, among other things. At this point, the positive effects of anti-imperialist nationalism have changed, metamorphosed. One is tempted to say metastasized into the negative effects of exclusivist, even expansionist ethno-territorial nationalism. At this point, I argued, something else is needed, a revival of the more cosmopolitan, pan-Caucasian tendencies of the past. I tried to mention that in our understanding of scholars in the West, nations are not things that existed objectively, unchanging throughout history, but rather modern nations are made up of peoples who believe they all share the same ethnicity or civic rights and believe that they should have, therefore, some political existence, right to rule themselves, and maybe a territory, the homeland of their own. Nations, I said, are congealed histories. They're made up of stories that people tell themselves about the past, and therefore determine who they are. Histories, in turn, are based on memories organized into narratives. Narrative is just a fancy word for stories. Whatever actually happened is far less important than how it is remembered. What's remembered, what has been forgotten or repressed on both sides, provides the shape, the template through which the world is understood. Nationalist violence or inter-ethnic cooperation and tolerance depend on what story, what narrative people tell about themselves and about their neighbors. What are the stories, tales of injustice or oppression or betrayal? If that's true, that the way we tell the stories about our past and who we are and who they are, then the tellers of the tales have enormous power, not absolute power, but great power to shape, reshape, edit, share their stories, and therefore, those storytellers, whether they be government leaders who call their opponents terrorists or foreigners within their own country, those leaders and journalists and historians and teachers, they are responsible for promoting a future either of one of living together peacefully or of violence. That's what I said. Well, unexpectedly to me, the reaction was explosive. Suddenly leaflets were distributed the next day to all the participants, pointedly challenging the assertion that Yerevan had ever had a Muslim majority. Newspapers and radio broadcasts attacked my speech. Hostile questions were directed to me at the conference, along with accusations that Sunni is an agent of the oil companies, that he shared a secret agenda with the State Department or the CIA. I thought to myself, show me the money. No one has ever offered me anything like this. Years before, during Soviet times, in America, I had been accused of being too far left, a communist, a red sympathizer. In the Soviet Union, I had been criticized for being bourgeoisie falsificator, that is, a bourgeois falsifier of Soviet history. And now, I was an agent of the CIA, and I didn't know whether to be relieved or embarrassed. When it was time to leave the hall, an angry crowd surrounded me, and I had to be taken out by the police. They were yelling at me, Davajanes, you are a traitor, hyena. My first response was to shout back that no, Gitnaganem, Hayem, I'm a scholar, I'm an Armenian. High chest, they said, Gitnagan chest. You are not an Armenian. I thought to myself, if I'm not Armenian, how can I be a traitor then? Either I'm in or I'm out. But anyway, it wasn't so amusing at the time. And the personal attacks continued after that. And a year later, a book appeared in Yerevan in Armenian, bitterly denouncing Western scholarship in general and my own work in particular. Well, then I started to think, and I'm still thinking, what happened? Why this reaction? What was this confrontation about? And what I think happened was that two different ways of thinking about identity were fighting with one another. And that was what the clash was about. Identity is a funny term now, used by scholars in a way different from the way ordinary people use the word identity. When most people say, my identity is Armenian or Turk or male or female or gay or straight or whatever, the most common everyday use of the term in what you might call normal identity talk is that you have an identity, maybe a single identity, an actual unity, an internal harmony, a single uncontested identity. And if you don't, you might be having an identity crisis, which doesn't sound like a good thing. But scholars began about 30 years ago to talk about identity in a different way. They began to say people have many identities that are being made and remade all the time. So identity is a provisional, temporary stabilization of a sense of self. It's the way you conceive of yourself or your group. And by the way, it's a continuous search for some solidity, some permanence, some place in a constantly shifting world. But the identity never stops being created and recreated. There's no closure. It's never fully naturalized or made the single essence of your being. So therefore, identities are more provisional, or you might say they are multiple. You can be many things at once. They are fractured. They're broken. They're situational. They depend on where you are, when you are there. They're changing. They're strategic. Sometimes you adopt an identity for a certain purpose. It may be advantageous to you at a certain moment to act in a certain way, and less to act in a different way. And these identities, which are so shifting, in fact, are determined by things like the situation you find yourself in, the historic, temporal, geographic context, the way you were educated, the way you were brought up, the situation you find yourself in, your socialization. Sometimes identities are forced on people. You are told by a government, you are Armenian, or you are Turk, or you are American, or something else. Often other people might look at you and decide you are this or you are that. So you have some control over your identity, but some parts of your identity are imposed on you by others. They can also be determined by sexual preferences or emotional attachments. Your feelings that you're more close to these people than to others, and distant and alienated from still others. Now, in the Soviet Union, people had specific experiences about who they were and what their identity was. Let's imagine first a Swedish woman born in Sweden, and she's born of parents who speak Swedish, and they identify themselves as Swedish. She's educated in Sweden. She's a Swede, and she identifies as a Swede. Not difficult. She never thinks of herself as an American, for instance. But then she married an American, and she migrated to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and she raised children there, and she was educated in the United States. She might, over time, even forget her Swedish, and she might think of herself more and more as an American. She's given up, in some sense, her original ethnic identity. She might or might not. Maybe she still makes Swedish food or something like that. But because it's easy for a North European, light-skinned, white-skinned, blonde, blue-eyed Swede to pass into America easily, more easily, let's say, than African Americans who have been there for 300 years, she becomes an American, no problem. Her children never think about Sweden. Her identity has shifted. But this was much more difficult to shift your identity in the Soviet Union. Let's take another woman. She was born in Tbilisi during Soviet times. Her parents spoke Georgian. They identified themselves and her as Georgian and educated in Georgia. She would be more likely to identify as Georgian even after she marries a Russian, moves to Russia, and raises children there who speak only Russian. Her ethnic identity remained. Why did it remain? And why was it different from the Swedish woman who went to America? First of all, her identity was fixed on her internal passport. Gruzinka. She was Georgian. And that went with her everywhere. She had an ascribed, official, state identity that she could not change. Her children, because one parent was Georgian and one parent was Russian, could choose at 16 which nationality they would choose to be. Most of them would choose Russian because of certain advantages in Soviet society, and because their father was Russian, they usually took the Russian identity, the father's identity. So here you had the Soviet Union, a multinational state, but one in which ethnicity was not only ascribed, but it was believed to be primordial. Primordial simply means that it was your identity, it was your ethnicity forever back to your ancestors, and it's in your blood. That's just who you are. Indeed, Soviet identity, by the last 50 years of Soviet power, was biologically determined. It was provided by who your parents were. So in many ways, in the Soviet Union, there was far less choice about who you would be than there was if you moved to the United States, right? And different societies, different countries with different legal systems and tolerance for difference have different degrees of acceptance or putting up barricades to who can become a member of that nationality. Until recently, immigrant Turks and Kurds in Germany could not become easily German citizens. That just recently changed about 10 years ago. And so it's become a little earlier, but they remain identified as Turks and Kurds precisely because of the kinds of barriers and prejudices that Germans have toward darker people of the Middle East, right? Armenians in Beirut remain Armenian. They don't easily cross over into an Islamic society. They might marry occasionally Greek Christians or someone else. But you can see that different situations will determine the degree of possibility of crossing or accepting a different ethnic characteristic. Now, the same things that happen in identities with people, I would argue, also happen in national identities, or what makes up nations. So there are two views of nations. We've talked a lot about empires, but now we're talking about nations, communities with which people in modern times identify, feel a part of, right? Nations can, in one side, be conceived of as eternal, always with you, part of your blood. Look, we have certain kinds of noses, they have certain kinds of hair, they have different skin color, etc. And that would be what we call a primordialist or essentialist view of the nation. But on the other side, and most nationalists believe in that view of the nation, and most ordinary people usually believe that the nation is really part of your internal being, your biology, or a deep culture. The other view of looking at nation, and the one that has been in the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years, been more and more adopted by scholars, is the view, not primordial view, but what we call the Constructivist view. And that is that nations are made in modern times out of different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different linguistic groups, different tribes, different whatever, who somehow come together and begin to feel and think that they share certain commonalities, certain qualities, we can call it their culture, and because they have those shared qualities and culture, perhaps origins, values, I'm reading from behind me, historical experiences, language, territory, anything like that, though that culture gives them the right to determine themselves politically, perhaps control a homeland of their own, and even a state, and gain benefits precisely in that way. In other words, as I said, I think in the first lecture, nation is a community that combines culture with political claims, right? That's different from the way, let's say, Armenians were in the 5th century or the 15th century. They may identify as Armenians. They may, in fact, have an idea of they were a special breed of people. They, in fact, were people who had a privileged religion, etc. But they did not necessarily believe that precisely because they are Armenian, they have the right to rule themselves. The right to rule was from God, not from the people. It was divine right. Certain people whose fathers had the right to rule had the right now to rule, not the people themselves. That changed in modern times. So like other identifications, nations can be thought of as groups of people who are themselves forming and reforming identities through time, stabilizing, sometimes destabilizing those identities. I like to think of nations as a group of people who argue about what nation they are a part of. Armenians should understand this very well. We are always arguing about Zut Hai Ches, you know, you're not a real Armenian, or Hai Ches, or if you want to be an Armenian, you ought to know the Armenian language, or you ought to go to the Armenian church, or you ought to do this, or you ought to do that. In other words, there are, you might call them ethnic police who guard the boundaries of the nationality of the nation and try to tell you who belongs and who doesn't belong. That argument about who is Armenian, who's not, who's a Turk and who's not, is precisely what keeps these nations alive and vital. I remember my mother telling me, you know, you were born an Armenian. I said to my mother once, I would like to go to the Protestant church, Methodist church down the street. It's close. My friends are all going there. And she said, no, you were born Armenian. You will remain Armenian. You will go to the Armenian church. You'll get married in that church, and you'll die in that church. Most of those predictions have been fulfilled so far. My mother had this idea of a primordial fixed identity, right? And that discussion, it gives a kind of vitality to the nation, the constant discussion. If you think about what's going on now in the United States with the building of walls by President Trump and the exclusion of Muslim immigrants and the triumph now of white Anglo-Saxon Americans who are happy that they finally got their country back after it being given to that black president for 8 years. If you think about that discussion, as ugly as it is in the United States at the moment, it's actually a discussion about what kind of country, what kind of nation are these Americans? Who belongs inside? Who belongs outside? Who should we keep out with walls and laws, etc.? Now, if you accept what I've just said, or if you at least allow me to say it in that way, nations then are those groups of people who tell stories about themselves, about their origins, about their continuity, stories of heroism, of sacrifice, of martyrdom, of vartanants, of the battle we lost. We lost in 451. How many people in the world still commemorate a battle they lost almost 2,000 years ago, right? Armenians do. And we believe it was a kind of triumph because we were allowed to keep our religion as well. Later, that Vartanant story, which is a story about religion and salvation and the church, would be changed into a story about nationhood and the glory of the Armenian people themselves, with some of the more religious elements pushed aside. So with the... Oh, it's not working? Yeah, here, have this one. Oh, good. Okay. Here you go. Okay, Okay, so I'll just speak a little bit slowly now while we wait for things to go. Now, are there any questions about any of that while he's out and getting his earphones? Yeah. Right, but that was in the 14th century. They were 1,000 years behind us. They're 1,000 years behind. Maybe the Chinese or the Indians celebrate a battle, but I've never heard of it because their civilizations go way back. It's true. It's not unusual that nations do that, that they talk about their martyrdom. And the Poles, for instance, their whole idea of their nation is about a martyred nation, right? Martyred by Russians, by Germans, by others. Okay. Now, what about the Soviet Union? What can I tell you about the Soviet Union more generally? And then I'm going to give you a kind of short history of the Armenians in the Soviet Union. I would argue that there are two ways that the story of non-Russians or non-Russian nationalities within the Soviet Union have been told. The standard Western story the story that grew up after the Bolshevik Revolution, and particularly during the Cold War, was the idea that the Soviet Union was a prison house of nations. That is, Soviet nations had always existed, Armenians, Ukrainians, whatever, but they were repressed by the communists, they were forcibly Russified or Sovietized, and they always wanted to be free, which was natural, of course, and finally they achieved their freedom in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. That's a standard story. It's a story you'll find in newspapers and among many other accounts. Now the story, the constructivist story, is a little different. And that's the one that I have subscribed to and tried to promote. And that is the Soviet Union, yes, on many occasions was repressive and did try to Sovietize people, not particularly Russify them, but Sovietize them. But it was also the crucible of nations, a kind of cradle in which new nations were formed, like Tajikistan or Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, which had never been nations before, or older ethnic religious groups, or nations, if you will, were reformed as modern nations. Armenia's story falls into that category. And they precisely were promoted and made stronger, more coherent as nations, precisely because of the Soviet Empire's state policies. A policy which is called indigenization, or in Russian, korenizatsiya, sort of a word that means rooting, putting people in their place. Now, the Soviet Empire, in fact, was an empire. There was inequality built into the system between the ruling communists and the rest of the people. And some nationalities were more privileged than others. Russians, for instance, were more privileged. Intellectuals were more privileged. Communist Party members were more privileged. Muslim peoples were less privileged. Armenians did pretty well. They were fairly privileged. They were considered an educated, mobile population, and Armenians, Soviet Armenians, tended to be, some people don't realize this, among the most loyal Soviet citizens in that empire. Understandably, of course, because across the border was Turkey, and they were always guaranteed safety because of the Red Army, because of the Soviet Army. So I want to tell the story now of what happened and how this Soviet Armenian nation was created and changed over time. And as I tell that story, you will see a kind of darkness and light in the story. There are terrible episodes. There are mass killings that take place, not on the scale of genocide, but certainly thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of people are killed. At the same time, there was the development within Soviet Union of the city of Yerevan, Armenian culture, film studios. More people were educated in Armenian, more books published in Armenian than in all the centuries before the establishment of Soviet Armenia. Soviet Armenia, of course, was built on a former republic, the Independent Republic of Armenia, which was founded in 1918, May 26, 1918. Now I'm forgetting which of those two dates it is. May 28th, I think. And which was largely run by the most popular political party among the Armenians, the Dashnak Suchun. And that little republic was immediately attacked by enemies, particularly the Ottoman army, and it barely survived for the few years that it managed to exist. But at the same time, that little republic was the scene of refugees, orphans from Turkey, from the Ottoman lands, from other places, victims of the genocide, survivors of the genocide. It was called the land of stalking death in 1920. and it had a very fragile existence. Hopefully, it would be defended by one or more of the great powers, possibly the United States, but ultimately, no one really came to the aid of the independent Armenia. And so, in early 1920, in late 1920, early 1921, the Red Army came into Armenia and took the capital of Yerevan rather peacefully. There was no great war. The Dashnags essentially gave up power because the country was threatened by Kemalist forces, the nationalist forces in Turkey, coming the other way from the south. A treaty was signed, and it was agreed in the first days of this new republic that in fact, the Armenia, now as a Soviet country, would, like Soviet Russia, basically not be the enemy of the Kemalists. Soviet Russia and the Kemalists were allies. Both were considered anti-imperialist powers by Lenin and Kemal. But it was very difficult for the few communists who came to Yerevan, a small party with not much support, to govern this little country. It was generally understood that the Dashnag Suchun remained the most popular party among the Armenians, and that the communists had very little support in the country, except for a few hundred radical intellectuals and workers. The population, as I showed you, was already hungry, sick, weary of war, and politically apathetic. They wanted security, they wanted development, they needed to survive. The revolution, if you want to call it, that brought the communists to power had been allowed to happen in order to prevent Eastern Armenia, what is now Armenia, from being overrun by the Ottomans, by the Kemalists, and the Armenians hoped that the Red Army would drive the Turks away from parts of the country that were occupied by the Turks. But that first government of the communists was a very young, headstrong, and militant government. Almost immediately, they began to arrest Dashnags, breaking the treaty they had made with them, and in fact killing some of them as well. The old antagonisms between communists and Dashnags continued in the early years of the new republic. Armenia was a devastated country, and it lost many of its privileges, institutions, and middle class that it had enjoyed in the years of the Tsarist Empire. If you think about it, the Armenian middle class that had dominated Tiflis and Baku was now suspect in the eyes of the new Soviet government, and they didn't know if they would survive there. So many middle class people left the Caucasus, emigrated to Paris or to America. And in some ways, the years of war, revolution, genocide, and the initial Soviet years were years in which Armenia suffered demodernization. It went backward. It lost much of what it had had in Tsarist times. Now, if in fact a country removes or loses its middle class, its entrepreneurs, its engineers, its managers, its intellectuals, through emigration or disease or death, the country is thus made impoverished intellectually and becomes less modern and less able to develop itself through the powers of society. For the Soviets, this might not have been so bad, because the Soviet idea of developing Armenia was top-down. It was the state that would govern, not a market-driven capitalism. If you think about Turkey, however, just across the border at that time, when the Kemalists came to power, they also faced a country that had been driven backward, demodernized, and they had lost many of their most talented middle-class, entrepreneurial, industrial, capitalist people. Armenians had been killed or fled. The Greeks would be expelled. So the Kemalists, too, began at a lower level of development. And in order to develop the country, they, too, had to depend on state intervention rather than the energies generated from society itself. The Kemalists, of course, were faced with their own military and social problems because the country was being invaded and provisionally divided among other great powers. And here's a map that shows advances of the Greeks. Armenians with their new republic were hoping to take lands in eastern Anatolia, and the great powers had their own plans for the division of Turkey, the so-called Treaty of Sevres, which would give Greeks, allied powers, France, England, etc., and Armenia, parts of the former Ottoman Empire. And so a war developed between Armenia, the Soviet Armenia, Dashnag Armenia, and the Kemalists, that ultimately the Soviet Armenians stopped. And the Soviet border was stabilized in the Treaty of Kars in 1921, and now Armenia could begin to develop itself slowly within a relatively peaceful environment guarded by the Red Army. But those early communists were very militant and very aggressive toward the imposition of their own powers and plans. And within a few months of the Soviets coming to power, of these young communists coming to power, the Dashnags revolted and overthrew the communist government. In February 1921, the Dashnag leaders actually took the city of Yerevan, and they held it for a few months until the Red Army came from Georgia and threw out the Dashnags and sent them packing. But as a result of this interlude, in which the communists, the more militant communists, had been overthrown, the Dashnags returned and then driven out, the second Armenian Soviet government was much more moderate. And this was just about the time that Lenin in Russia was organizing and implementing the new economic policy, a more moderate policy, not imposing social change so rapidly, but allowing peasants to grow their own food, pay a tax to the state, and develop the economy on their own. And so if you look, and I'll have to be very general and fast here, if you look at the history of the 1920s, in Soviet Armenia, it's basically a time of restoration, of rebuilding the economy, and of normal people accommodating themselves, becoming accustomed to the rule of the communists. Indeed, one could say that the 1920s was probably one of the happiest times in the history of Soviet Armenia. It was a time when hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Middle East and from Europe gravitated and came to Armenia and settled in this new country. Armenia was part of a Transcaucasian federation and also part of the Soviet Union. It had sort of two levels of bureaucracy above it. But as much as the country was beginning slowly to recover and develop, it should be remembered that Soviet Armenia lost its sovereignty. It lost its own power, in fact, to govern itself fully. Most decisions of any importance after the first few years of Soviet power were made in Moscow. And a single party was allowed to exist, the Communist Party, which obeyed the center. The 1920s in Soviet history is also marked by the suppression of dissent, of increased censorship, of the exiling of intellectuals, and the coming to power of a single man, Joseph Stalin, who by the 1930s would become the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union. And so this picture I find very interesting. Here you have Lenin with Stalin toward the end of Lenin's life, roughly around 1920, 1921. And when I looked at this picture as I was putting it together, it seemed to me that these two men are rather uncomfortable with one another. It's roughly around this time that Lenin, who earlier had promoted Stalin to positions of power, became increasingly suspicious of Stalin. He has accumulated too much power in his hands, Lenin wrote to his comrades. He in fact should be removed from his position as general secretary of the party. He wants the Soviet Union to be too centralized and under the control of Moscow, when Lenin would prefer giving more power to the various republics within the country. But Lenin then, in 1921, had a series of strokes that eventually, 1922 actually, that eventually incapacitated him and made him unable to fight against Stalin. When Stalin's comrades received Lenin's so-called testament or letter, in which Lenin had written, you must try to get rid of Stalin or put him aside in another job, he's too uncomradely, they discussed Lenin's views, and they decided not to remove Stalin, but to keep him in his position. Every single person in that room who voted to keep Stalin either died before the 1930s or was murdered by Stalin in the great purges of the 1930s. Only Trotsky survived till 1940, when Stalin sent an assassin to Mexico who killed Trotsky in his home with an ice pick to the back of his head. This was under Stalin, and you can use the word Stalinism to describe the period from roughly 1928 to the death of Stalin in 1953. And that's a different period of Soviet history. Here are three of the leading Bolsheviks, communists, who ruled the Soviet Union. On one side, you have Anastas Mikoyan, the highest ranked Armenian commissar in the country. In the center is Stalin, and then over here is Sergo Orjonikidze, the leading Georgian communist. In fact, after Stalin, of course, Mikoyan would be the only one to survive Stalin's rule. Orjonikidze had a falling out with Stalin in 1937 and committed suicide. So, how should we characterize this period of the 1930s? In some ways, it was a heroic period. It was a period of forced collectivization of agriculture, of driven rapid industrialization, of military preparedness, and of enthusiasm for the building of what they conceived to be socialism. Of course, these were things with high costs. Collectivization was not something desired by the peasants, and in fact, tens of thousands of people died in the collectivization or were exiled. Some were shot later in 1937. So you both have a heroic side to Stalinism, building the country up industrially, preparing it for what they inevitably thought was a war to come, which of course did come. At the same time, you have this terrible destruction. Imagine this, that Stalin and his regime had almost 700,000 people shot in 1937, 1938. That is a huge number, largely intellectuals, former communists, managers, etc. The largest killing of that sort by a domestic regime, by a regime on its own people in the interwar period. So that's the combination. It was a strange thing. But it was also a period in which Armenians were being allowed to become more Armenian. There were schools in the language. There were textbooks. There were film studios. Here's a slide with Amo Beknazarov, the leading Armenian filmmaker, who made such films as Pepo and Khatabala and Namus and others. This was a first that these kinds of activities occurred. A university developed. A technical intelligentsia developed. Novels were written, but all within the all within the confines of the Stalinist regime. That is, you could be socialist, but you couldn't be very nationalist at the same time. And all those restraints would be felt deeply by the population as well. So there was tremendous enthusiasm for the regime, and there was tremendous fear coexisting at the same time. The church which had been one of the few semi-independent institutions, was crushed by Stalin, and we believe that the Catholicos was murdered by the secret police. There's no great proof of that. It hasn't come out in the archives, but there are rumors to that effect. By the late 1930s, the leading Armenian communists themselves were arrested and shot by the Stalinist regime. There was one fellow named Agazit Khanjan, very popular man, Communist Party first secretary in Armenia, and he went he was called to Tbilisi to meet with Lavrenti Beria, one of Stalin's leading lieutenants, and the next day he was found dead, either pushed or killed, thrown out of a window. They claimed it was a suicide in Tbilisi. So these were the kinds of things that were occurring. I want to tell you a story from my own family at the time. My grandfather, my father's father, was Grigor Mirzayan Suni. He was a composer and a musician. And some people, even in Istanbul, have sung his songs in choruses here in town. And indeed, in about 1921-22, he lived here and had choruses in various churches in Üsküdar and in the city here. They eventually emigrated to America. Suni had been a Dashnag earlier. He was for Armenia. And in America, he became a communist. He joined a small Armenian group of communists who were pro-Soviet and so forth. But in 1937, Grigor Suni gave a speech to the Armenian communists of the city of Philadelphia in which he criticized Stalin and criticized the purges going on in Armenia. For that crime, he would have been killed in Yerevan. Luckily, he was in Philadelphia. But he was thrown out of the party, even though he remained a dedicated Marxist to the end. He died 2 years later, before I was born. And he never was allowed again to have his music played in Armenia. So they made him a non-person in Armenia, even though up to 1937, he had been a staunch, serious supporter of the Soviet regime for that crime of criticism. This is an anti-religious poster from the Soviet Union. It says, "Religion is poison, save the children." You can see the old woman trying to take the child to the church while she wants to go to shkola, to school, and she's not being permitted. Stalin's revolution may have, in some sense, saved the Soviet Union in the dark days of the Second World War. One should remember that the Soviet Union, the Red Army, the sacrifices of 27 million dead Soviet citizens, huge numbers of Armenians, in fact, in World War II, those sacrifices, in fact, defeated Nazism, defeated fascism, won the war, particularly on the Eastern Front, against the Nazis, and saved the world from fascism, saved the world for capitalism and democracy in the years to come. Stalin died in 1953, and in the post-Stalin years, here's Stalin one more time. You can see his figure is bigger than everybody else's. Here's a poster that's celebrating the workers and the farmers. In the years after Stalin's death, in the years from 1953 up through 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were several trends that can be mentioned. Armenians were freer than they had been before. Many people returned from the prison camps and concentration camps to Armenia and could tell the tales of what they had suffered during the Stalin years. I remember such people coming back when I was a student in Yerevan. The intelligentsia developed. And in the course of this freer atmosphere, Armenian nationalism developed as well. So within the confines of the Soviet Union, where nationalism was a negative thing, in fact, there was a growing sense of pride in being Armenians, in the sacrifices of Armenians, in their long history, being the oldest part of the Soviet Union. They dated their existence back to Urartu, which ruins of which could be found in their country. And then when Gorbachev came to power in the mid-1980s, 1985, 1986, And he began further to loosen up the control of Moscow over the regions. Armenians themselves demonstrated en masse. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people, went out into the streets in order to get Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian enclave, which had been given in the early 1920s to the Republic of Azerbaijan. Karabakh was 75% Armenian, 25% Muslim. And the Karabakh Soviet, which was after all just a rubber stamp Soviet, it had no real power, suddenly, on its own initiative, in February 1988, decided it wanted to join Armenia and passed a ruling to join Armenia. And this began a conflict over the status of Karabakh, which eventually became a war between Azerbaijan and the Armenians of Karabakh, aided by Armenia, and eventually Karabakh became a kind of semi-independent republic within the confines of Azerbaijan. This nationalism, this war that erupted in those years, was the legacy that was left by Soviet Armenia to post-Soviet Armenia, to independent Armenia. And so when I arrived in the late 1990s back in Yerevan, unaware, not suspecting how virulent this nationalism had grown. So virulent, in fact, that any expression of criticism of Armenian history, of the way they were telling their story, of the government, which was notoriously corrupt, all of those things would be considered anathema, something not to be done, especially in front of foreigners. So the story of Soviet Armenia that I've tried to tell you is a story, it's a complex story. It's one of the formation, it's a story of the formation of a new kind of Armenian national identity. But the socialist part, the Soviet part, rapidly disintegrated, rapidly dissipated, disappeared. But the national part, the cohesion of Armenians, developed and is maintained today. And it's that story, that kind of identity of Armenia, a kind of more exclusivist nationalism, which is particularly powerful in our own times. Armenia had always been, as I said, the most ethnically homogeneous of the republics of the Soviet Union. And now it is nearly 99.9% Armenian, having driven out the Azerbaijanis, about 180,000 of them in 1988, 1989, in retaliation for the driving out of Armenians who had lived in Baku, Sumgait, where there were massacres of Armenians, and other parts of Azerbaijan. So now what we have in the Caucasus are far more ethnically homogeneous republics. Azerbaijan is almost completely Azerbaijani. Armenia is completely Armenian. And Georgia increasingly is almost completely Georgian, except that there's a large 200,000 or more Armenians living in Tiflis and other Armenians living in parts of Georgia, which we call Javakh or Javakheti. Is there a lesson to be learned from this? It's a complex lesson about nationalism, because nationalism can at times be progressive. It can make a people coherent. It can help forge the body of a nation that can then become democratic. It can be a powerful weapon against imperialism and colonialism, as we've seen in many places. But at the same time, nationalism can be too exclusive. It can be isolating. It can lead people to think that their only way out, their only salvation, is through their own efforts. And it can make a nation weaker than it might be otherwise. Think about what's happening in large parts of the world today as more nationalist leaders develop. In this country, a kind of Islamic nationalism is gaining strength, urged on by the President of the Republic. In Hungary, a kind of exclusionary right-wing Hungarian nationalism is developing. Throughout much of Europe, there are these populist nativist, anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant movements that are gaining power. We just saw yesterday in Holland that the Nationalist Party rose in its representation, though it did not win the election. People are fearful that things like Brexit, the leaving of England from the European Union, a nationalist move, or the victory of Donald Trump in the United States, again, a nativist, nationalist, even white racist movement in the United States, that these kinds of things may be reflected in the future in the elections in France or in Germany. So we are living at a very interesting moment, a moment of shift and change, in which the world is going to have to decide, is this a world in which peoples are going to be able to live together in multi-ethnic, multinational, multicultural societies? Is capitalist globalization going to erode borders? Or, in fact, are we going to turn in on ourselves, as many countries have done or are doing, live by ourselves, and think somehow that's a salvation for the human race? Thank you.